Hi, chemistry students. We're going to start off with our atomic history series talking about a scientist named John Dalton and kind of his contribution to where we ended up with the atom. Before I talk about Dalton, I thought I'd talk a little bit about where we were before we had Dalton. We started with a philosopher named Democritus, and he was the first person to come up with an idea of atom. He's actually kind of the person who named it. But he was a Greek philosopher, so he didn't do any experiments, he didn't do anything to try to prove anything about atoms, he just was kind of a thinker. He's the person generally credited with the idea of democracy, but what he basically kind of thought is if I took some kind of block and I cut it in half, and then I cut it in half, and then I cut that in half, and cut that in half, at some point, what he kind of theorized, or kind of what he philosophized, I guess if that's a term, is that at some point you're going to get down to a fundamental unit that you can't cut in half anymore. And so kind of we came up with this idea of atmos, which in Greek is kind of the root for indivisible. He had no evidence to support this, but this kind of started our continuous versus discontinuous theory of matter, and that at some point we're going to get down to some fundamental unit that you can't break down any further than what it already is. So Democritus had this kind of model of his atmos, which is just a solid indestructible sphere. He didn't know about things called protons, electrons, neutrons. He just thought it was solid, he thought it was indestructible. So next, basically after those Greeks, most of human history was ruled, or chemistry was really ruled by alchemy. So in alchemy, basically what the belief was is that, hey, we can get rich if we could figure out some combination of things to turn cheap metals and turn them into something valuable, like gold. Remember back then they used to believe that everything was made of like earth, wind, fire, water. And so if everything was made of the same things, then at some point they should be able to mix them together and get gold, is what they originally had thought. So these alchemists were almost kind of like magicians. Now we get to Dalton, and believe it or not, between Democritus and Dalton there was not a lot of research being done on the atom. And so he was kind of one of the first people to come along now. He wasn't the first one, but the first person really to add to what the model of the atom was. And what he basically stated is that elements consisted of tiny particles named atoms. And the difference between him and Democritus, now Democritus basically kind of said the same thing, that everything was made of these small particles. But what Dalton did was he was able to support that with evidence and really kind of bring the scientific community into this discussion. And so what he basically did is that he made assumptions about like kind of fundamental little pieces of elements, because he found out that some of them always combined in the same ratio, and that ratio always ended up being a whole number. So he thought that like at some fundamental unit, since like this thing always combines with this thing in a certain way, that there have to be like little individual components of that you can't get like a half of. And so he basically did a lot of very precise measurements and a lot of experiments with this multiple proportions idea, and came up with this theory. And his atomic theory kind of had like four kind of main parts that everything fell into. It was like a big long paper, and so this is what I'm trying to summarize here. First of all, he said that elements are composed of extremely small particles called atoms. Next, he said all atoms of a given element have identical properties, and those properties differ from different elements. Then he said that the compounds are formed, so this is like what he was doing in experiments, when atoms of different elements combine with one another, and they do that in whole number ratios, that you can't get like half of an atom to combine with something else. It's always together like that. And then he found out that the relative numbers and kinds of atoms are consistent given a compound. They always do this the same way. So that really kind of sums up Dalton's atomic theory. So these are kind of main things that you should know about what Dalton did. Basically, he was the first person to bring scientific evidence into this idea of an atom. And for his model of an atom, he really didn't differ very much from what we had before. So I'd make sure that you sketch down kind of what each of these models look like when we talk about these models. But really, I like to call this the bowling ball model because it's just a solid sphere, and that the different spheres have different properties. And so he started referring to these as atoms, and these atoms were elements. Dalton was colorblind, and so the way that he kind of indicated, you notice here that he's got all these different shapes. They're all little spheres, but he kind of drew them all a little bit differently to indicate different elements. So that's all about Dalton and the atomic history.